All right, so I fixed the issues with my simulator, so now I can show you that what we implemented before works. So we're combining the text from the custom greetings text field with the text in the name text field, and the result is going to be displayed up here in the greetings label, no matter in which of the two we type. And that is because we combined the two observables, the name observable and the custom greeting observable, using the call to combine latest and specifying how we want to combine the two values from the two observables, creating a new observable called greeting with name observable, and binding the contents of this observable to the greetings label right here. All right, so the next feature that I want to implement is actually the enabling and disabling of the buttons and the text field. So remember that one requirement we had is that when the use button segment is selected in the segmented control, we actually want to disable the text field right here, whereas when the text field is disabled, when the text field segment is selected in the segmented control, then we want to disable all the predefined greetings buttons down here. So again, how we are going to do this is with a binding. And the first thing that we need to create for this is an observable for the segmented control, because really that's what's going to decide whether the buttons or the text field will be enabled. So in the same way that we created an observable for the text field, we can now go ahead and create an observable for the state of the segmented control. I call it segmented control observable, and this time it's going to be an observable of type int. Why is it int this time? Well, because the selected segment is represented by an index, so either 0 or 1, and then we're going to use this index to decide whether we want to enable or disable the text field or the buttons. The way how we obtain this observable again is by using the segmented control. We are using the Rx property that gives us access to the reactive extensions, and actually it's called value rx.value will give us access to the selected index of the segmented control, and by calling as observable on this, we're getting this information as an observable. So again, if we subscribe to this observable now, we would receive values that correspond to either 0 or 1 whenever we change the selected segment. But in fact, what we want to do is we want to use this enum state that I created up here. And based on the state, we can decide whether we want to implement buttons, enable or disable the buttons or the text field. So now we're coming to a very important feature when we're using RxSwift, and that is transformations of the contents of an observable. So notice that right here we have an observable of type int, but eventually when we want to bind the information whether the text field or the button should be enabled or disabled, when we want to bind this information, we need a bool, right? Because the isEnabled property of the text field, for example, custom greeting observer, so we could take the segmented control observable and we could try to do the bind to, and then we want to bind it to the greetings text field enabled property. So this binding will actually not work because the isEnabled property is of type bool, whereas the values that are contained in the segmented control observable right now are of type int. So we somehow have to transform this integer that is inside this observable into a bool so that we can make this binding succeed. So let's try and do that by using the map function. Recall that map function, or that map, is actually a function that is defined in the Swift standard library on arrays, and how it works is that it takes every single element inside the array and it transforms it to something else. So we could transform integers to strings or the other way around. We could also apply an operation on the element. So if we have an array of integers, we could multiply every element in there by 5, for example, and the result of this would be the return value of map. When dealing with observables, because observables are basically sequences, so kind of asynchronous arrays that we're dealing with here, we can also call the map function, and we can transform every element that is inside the observable into a different one. And the first thing that I want to do here is that I want to create an observable for the state. So the state will indicate whether we are currently using the text field or the buttons. And because we are getting an integer here, and that is the selected index of the segmented control, and we want to return a state, we have to go, and what we can just do is we can use the initializer of this enum because it has raw values of type int, so we can go ahead and return state, and then we're using the initializer that takes the raw value selected index. And because we can only receive 0 or 1 from the segmented control, we can force unwrap relatively safely here. And now we've got this observable of type state. If we were try to bind this to our greetings text field, it would still not work. Because what we have inside the state observable right now is the state, is of type state. And again, we have the type bool. So we will need another transformation before we can do the binding. So let's create a new observable that is called, let me put a comment here, a new observable that is called greeting text field enabled observable. And this time it's going to be of type bool. And the way how we obtain this observable is by calling map on the state observable, and here we are receiving a state and returning a bool. And the greeting text field actually should be enabled when the state equals use text field. So what we can just return here is state equal dot use text field. All right, and now we can finally go and bind this result to the greetings text field is enabled property, and and as usual when we create a binding, we have to add the result to the dispose back. Let me run the application now, and let's convince ourselves that this code actually works. Here's the simulator. And we already see that use buttons is selected and the greeting text field is disabled. If I say use text field here, then it will be enabled again. But as soon as I select the segment with button index 0, then it will be disabled. And that's the functionality that we wanted.